Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I have a video for you. Thank you for sticking with me in these less productive weeks past. If you are not following me on social media, then you probably do not know this, but I was diagnosed with a very, very serious illness that required immediate surgery. I've had a number of medical situations that I've had to deal with in the last several weeks. And well, as you know, there's been a lot going on my end with my family, medical wise, and so forth. So it's been a trying couple of months, and I really appreciate the words of support from those of you through Patreon, as well as those of you following me on social media and elsewhere. That is, of course, it means a lot, especially when you're going through something that is as life altering as what I've gone through the last few weeks and months. So, for those of you who have reached out, thank you. I mean that as genuinely as I possibly can from the bottom of my heart and all the rest of those such cliches. There's a lot going on, and I'm going to do my best to be here in front of the camera talking to you about issues from around the world, things that are or are not being discussed in the media. But just know that I haven't gone anywhere. I plan on being here for many, 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 many more years into the future, and providing the analysis that hopefully some of you are looking for, and maybe some of you are not. But if you found me on YouTube, then so be it. So anyway, I want to talk today a little bit about something related to Russia's war in Ukraine that is unfortunately not discussed nearly enough. And that is the kind of one of the other wars that's going on as a result of the war in Ukraine. And I'm not talking about a war in another part of the world involving different countries. I'm not talking about a war in which the Russians are backing one particular side, as we have several examples of those. No, I'm talking about the war on nature itself, the war on the environment that is going on in Russia. Okay, this is a direct product of Russia's war in Ukraine. I'm going to talk through some of the reasons why that is. Now, I will just preface the comments by saying this is in no way to suggest that Russia is the only country that is engaged in what you might call a war against nature or a crime against nature, a crime against the environment, a crime against Mother Earth, right? This is something that is going on from every major power throughout the so called global north, the developed world. Russia's one example of that, but Russia, in the context of the war in Ukraine and how it's impacted Russian policy on the environment, that is something that needs to be explored in depth. I was just thinking through as I was preparing my notes for this conversation or for this video that the United States military remains by far the number one polluting entity in the world, non-state polluting entity. The U.S. military alone is responsible for more of the impacts of climate change than any other military or probably any other state in the world. That's not even counting all of the U.S.'s emissions and pollution from the chemicals industry and the petroleum industries and all of the other dirty industries and really all of the other industries that make up capitalism. The United States is the primary driver of climate change, even among developed countries, along with China. Of course, because of the size and the emissions and so forth. So I say all of that because I don't want a takeaway from this video to be, well, he thinks that Russia's some kind of principal aggressor, crime, criminal against nature or something like this. No, but I do think it's important to understand from the West what's going on in Russia vis-a-vis environmental policy. So let's talk a little bit about this. Russia's war has significantly altered many of the environmental goals and environmental policies that had been put forward even within Russia. Now, we should understand Russia was by no means a world leader on environmental policy. If anything, Russia is one of the dirtier countries in terms of the kinds of industries that drive its exports and how it generates its revenue: oil, gas, weapons sales, nuclear, and so forth. Right. So Russia is a real culprit when it comes to environmental degradation on the planet. That being said, the war has kind of supercharged a lot of this environmental destruction. At the same time, it's sidelined whatever more progressive environmental policies may have emerged from the Kremlin. I'm going to talk about those in a second. So there's two things that are happening simultaneously that have to be understood. One is the sanctions and the impact of the sanctions on Russia's ability to even accomplish and to carry out any of its previously stated environmental policy objectives. Okay, so the sanctions make it very difficult. And also, there's a second component to this that is, I think, too often ignored, and that is that it is not just sanctions, it is also voluntary boycott of Russia by key corporations in Europe and in the West broadly that is also hampering Russia's ability to do this, because there are plenty of sectors of the economy where you don't have formal sanctions as you do, say, on the oil sector or on the nuclear sector or whatever you, where the formal sanctions are not so much the hurdle, but rather the kind of voluntary boycotting of Russia in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine. And that's true of hundreds of companies, European companies, American companies, Japanese companies, and others, right? That is also a big problem. And they're not exactly the same, right? To voluntarily choose not to do business with Russia because you think it might ultimately hurt your public image with whatever your other customers might be is not the same as adhering to a very rigidly and legally structured sanctions regime, right? So I want to make that point first. So you have, as one example, you have a delay in the projects that were designed to reduce emissions in Russia. One, probably the most important one, called the Clean Air Plan, which had envisioned, this was originally passed in 2020 in Russia. This envisioned that by the end of 2024, you would have a 20% decrease in polluting emissions in Russia's 12 most polluted cities. Again, Russia has a lot of cities that are real, the textbook definition of industrial towns, industrial cities, right? That exist basically in and around whatever the industry might be, whether it's extractive mining, coal. Production, military production, whatever it might be. You have a lot of these type of factory cities, and the 12 most polluted ones, they were supposed to see their emissions decrease by 20%. Again, really modest goal, right? That's really doesn't I don't want to say it's a drop in the bucket, but it's a fairly modest goal. 20% decrease by 2024. So 4-year lead time to decrease emissions by 20% just in those 12 cities. That is off the table now. It has officially been postponed till 2026. The Clean Air Plan is essentially dead. Right. You also have seen the postponement of fines and regulatory enforcement from the environmental regulatory agencies in Russia, who are now basically unable to have any muscle behind their violations that they might find. Part of the reason for that is, of course, that many of these industries, the most dirty, polluting industries, are now essential, deemed economically essential by the Russian state as it's been cut off from sources internationally. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the fines are being postponed. So there's two aspects to that. One is the lack of revenue that would come out of those fines. Revenue is important for the state, of course, right? It's good to be able to have some of the most polluting industries, coal and others, that then have to at least turn around and remunerate the state to some extent. Not that that's necessarily a good thing, but it's better than nothing, right? That's not happening anymore. The oligarchs that are making a killing off of the current situation, which there are some, again, coal, oil, gas, any of those oligarchs that have been in that game, they're doing quite well out of this war as Russia has shifted its sourcing more internally, as these oligarchs and their companies have been able to sort of consolidate their market control. You also have tech sanctions, technology sanctions, which have made it very difficult, if not impossible, for Russian companies and for the Russian state to access the technologies that it would need for a lot of the environmental protection, to implement a lot of these policies. Quite frankly, import substitution ain't going to cut it for Russia. There are tons of technologies that they need, from energy storage to sewage modernization to disposal to transportation and what have you. A lot of these components that need to come from European and or American and or Japanese or Korean businesses, and they're not coming. Okay, so you have this increased sort of substitution by domestically produced products. And of course, look, I don't have to explain to anybody who knows anything about import substitution. You can't simply, substitute for a complex import, right? Just because you substitute B for A, it doesn't mean that B operates at the quality of A. And that's exactly what's happening. The Russians are using import substitution to the extent that they can, and that creates a tremendous risk of environmental destruction. There could be an accident, among many other potentialities. There could be a major accident. There could be something else that could happen as a result of the fact that the Russians have not been able to get the proper components. Okay, the modern equipment and other monitoring devices and other things that they might need that they would normally have purchased from, a company in Switzerland or in Germany or in, wherever. Right. So that's a big part of all of this. You have at the same time an expansion of sort of economic development, or maybe we should say economic exploitation of previously protected wildlife areas, forests, and other natural preserves that Russian environmental campaigners and others in the environmental movement have been campaigning to protect for decades and decades now. Many of those protected areas now have lost their protected status. They are now being opened up to mining and other forms of extractive industry for the purposes of propping up a failing economy, as we all can see from the sanctions regime that the United States and the Europeans have imposed upon Russia. Russia is now hurting economically, and it's looking to try to fill some of those gaps by extracting some of the raw materials that it might need, whether it's gold or other precious metals or rare earth minerals or some other things, right? Russia is rich in these resources, but that richness comes at a tremendous environmental cost. To extract these products means to despoil and to destroy much of the wilderness. Maybe not much because Russia's so huge, but significant portions of protected wilderness in Russia. And that, of course, leads to all sorts of other knock-on effects and impacts on wildlife, impacts on fauna and other things. Of course, Russia's also got a tremendous proportion of the global Arctic shoreline. That what happens in Russia environmentally impacts the entire Arctic, which itself is something of a ticking time bomb, as we all know. So there are knock-on effects, and there are knock-on effects to the knock-on effects that we have to really keep in mind here as we think about this. And there's a number of examples. As I mentioned already, the Arctic, super rich in raw materials, as we know, oil and gas, of course, but many others as well, precious metals, rare earths, all the things I've already mentioned. As one example of what I'm talking about, look at the Russian nuclear agency, Rosatom. Rosatom recently announced, actually last year, announced a mining project for gold and other precious metals and rare earths. And that mining project is going to be taking place in the Arctic. Okay, and again, I said Rosatom. This is not just your normal mining operation. This is nuclear powered mining operations. Okay, nuclear powered mining operations. Think what might happen with even a small-scale accident at a nuclear-powered mining facility that the Russians are operating in the Arctic. Think what implications it might have for the entire Arctic, for the entire world. Exceedingly dangerous. And the Russians, for their part, feel that they've been backed into a corner and they have to do this. This is not even to mention the fact that Rosatom's projected cost for the project is over 1.5 trillion rubles. I mean, we're talking billions and billions and billions of US dollars, or rubles that really should be invested in developing the road infrastructure outside of the major cities, which is of a third, fourth rate, developing the healthcare sector, helping the sick, the elderly, those that are suffering from inflation, from the economic impact of the war, etc. Right? There's a million ways that money could be used, and instead, the Russians are, it seems, going to plow that money into, again, nuclear-powered mining projects in the Arctic. I mean, talk about combining 3 or 4 horrible-sounding things into one awful, multi-headed hydra of environmental disaster. That's what the Russians are pushing towards. And again, I mean, I want to condemn the Russians, obviously, for doing this. But at the same time, I think we all can see that the Russians are doing this out of necessity. They frankly have no other choices here. You can't simply substitute for all of these raw materials. It's just not possible, right? So this is, again, another way in which the war and then the direct impacts of the war, whether they sanctions or boycott or whatever, that is now pushing Russia's response, which of course is going to have a negative effect for all of us. Environmental modernization projects. This is another side of this, is the sort of the protection or stripping away of environmental protections, but there's also the delaying or outright canceling of modernization projects. This is simply from the fact that they can't get the foreign technology that they might need. They can't simply substitute with imports with domestically made products on a lot of these things, as I've already mentioned. Experts, and I actually have done videos on this going back to early last year. If you're new to my videos, go to the YouTube page, go back to March and April of 2022, and you'll see that I did videos talking about how far Russia may have set itself back with its invasion of Ukraine, set itself back in terms of its ability to exist and to compete in the modern global capitalist system. I said back then, and I think I was correct, and others as well, that at least 5 to 10 years Russia set itself back, minimum 5 to 10 years, in terms of technology, in terms of its ability to modernize all of these things. It's 2023, and the Russians haven't upgraded their sewage treatment in probably 30 years. Now, again, as I said at the opening of this video, that's absolutely true of the United States as well. If you drive around the United States and you see the collapsing infrastructure of our bridges and our roads and our tunnels and all these other things, you're like, what's he talking about? Same shit in the US. That's true. But the US, unlike Russia, is not internationally isolated. The US is run by a corrupt oligarchy that manages to enrich itself and its friends at the expense of all of the rest of us, much like in Russia. But the United States is not frozen out of these technologies. If anything, the United States remains one of the key drivers of these technological innovations and how they relate to global capital flows, etc. It's one of the things that comes with American hegemony, U.S. global imperial power. Russia, for the junior imperialist that it is, Russia doesn't exercise nearly that kind of influence. And for that reason, Russia can't just buy things abroad the way that the United States can. It can't just access tech the way that the United States can. It's one of the imbalances here. It's one of the reasons why U.S. imperialism doesn't just disappear. Okay, we got to talk about the fact that the Russians are now saying that they have to source their tech from quote unquote friendly countries. Friendly countries. Well, realistically, we're only talking about a couple of countries, right? Because they're not, I mean, to be honest, they're not sourcing much of their technologies from sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America or wherever. They're really talking about China, India, maybe one or two other countries. That's about it, right? The Russians don't have a tremendous amount of options, and really, if we're being just sort of blunt about it, it's mainly China. Russia has to become almost entirely dependent upon China, especially when it comes to anything tech, and that is certainly true. Now, again, I want to just reiterate the point that although Russia's economy is being hit hard by the war, including that 2022 saw like a 2.5% decrease in GDP. That quite likely we'll see something similar in 2023, even with the propping up of the economy with oil prices that came late last year and early this year. We still see the Russian economy being hit hard, but there are certain oligarchs that are making a killing, and this is part of how Putin manages to maintain his power, to stay in control, and more importantly, this should remind us of the very, sort of tenuous grasp of reality that a lot of people who predict Putin's downfall seem to have. They keep thinking that the oligarchs are just going to turn on Putin because everything is so bad. Well, it's not really so bad if you're certain oligarchs. Again, if you're one of those oligarchs who controls coal or oil or gas or some of the other raw materials or other things that have really been boosted by this war and by the economic isolation and so forth, then you're doing great. and you're going to do everything you can to continue supporting Putin. So even the politics of this becomes complicated. But to return, and I'm approaching 20 minutes, I'm going to be done here in a second. But to return to the environmental side of this, as we all know, the entire planet is in an environmental crisis. And what I see with what the Russians are doing is only helping to accelerate that crisis further. Now, the Russians, as I mentioned, are not the primary drivers of climate change. They're not the largest economy. They're not the largest emitter and so forth. But Russia is becoming economically desperate. And in desperate times, desperate measures are taken. And desperate measures, when it comes to the environment, could have catastrophic effects for all of us. Again, nuclear powered extraction of minerals from the Arctic. Think about that for a second. Just think about that for a second. An inability to modernize the nuclear sector, the waste management sector, the water distribution infrastructure, a whole host of other things. Think about the environmental impacts. Think about what it means when Russia strips away environmental protections from vast swaths of Siberia, of the Far East, and so forth, right? These are the kinds of changes that are coming as a result of the war, which will then only accelerate many of the other problems that we're talking about globally. This is not just about Russia. This is about the entire planet. But in this context, we should understand just how much Russia's criminal and disastrous blunder in Ukraine is going to impact all of us. Not the least of which, the Russian people and those in the areas around there. Climate change is, of course, the one of the great crises of our time, and it's only going to get worse with this war and with the wars that follow. A lot more to say. I will leave it there. Again, hit the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. I really, really, really need those subscriptions. Really appreciate the support from those of you who have been following. And of course, if you want access to all of these videos, not just the ones that I put up for free on YouTube, go over to Patreon, subscribe there, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. I have a lot more that I'm going to do. And well, I'm still recovering, so I'm not back at work yet. I got more videos I can record. Talk to you all next time.